Well, this is part 2, where I'm going to continue discussing the modes of the process of reality self-promulgation. And the modes are basically ways that the substance makes itself immanent and produces the fruit of this immanentization or eminence. The fruit of this becomes a fractal repetition, as it were, of development from the essence of conception in a specific type of form or imago that develops by learning things which are essential to its own nature in various forms. By the way, I have to apologize for the filming conditions, both before and now, because basically, the situation here where I'm at right now is such that it's difficult to find a good, stable, peaceful place to sit and just do a quick video without getting direct interference. I have to tell you, this town has proven to me that it's basically a fifth column capital, or I don't know, main repository or something. It looks like a city, but it's like fifth columnville. It's like everybody's either handled or a handler. It's incredible. There are a lot of dupes, yes, but they're basically handled whether they know it or not. Which gets back to the discussion of fraud. If you live in a society that has a certain form that's supposed to manifest a certain result, say the development of a certain culture, in order to help the new generations promulgate the values that had brought them into existence and which are in their DNA and their substance, just to take a concrete example of this template, then you're going to have some respect for those values enough to defend them against fraud. So let's take fraud as the form of criminality, which is perhaps more fundamental than violence, because it's more the essence of violence, where deception is employed to maximum effect, to such a degree that someone may actually think they were trading and getting a value out of what was basically them being robbed. Basically, there has to be a heuristic or a certain type of investigative methodology which helps people do that, and that's how sciences and arts and various technologies were developed. For example, the discovery that by Archimedes that the density of gold, once known, can help one determine what the alloy of an object is, no matter what its dimensions, however convoluted and complex, by testing that known density against the displacement of water that creates, which is its volume, and then seeing if they have the same density by checking the weight against that volume. And if it doesn't, then it's got something else other than gold, or a certain amount of gold. So Archimedes discovered this, and that helped uncover frauds which were going on, where, for example, the king's crown was made without the appropriate amount of gold in it. Something was mixed in. This guy was, taking a pinch out for himself, basically, telling the king that he was getting so much. That's fraud, right? And there was a science, an investigative method, which discovered the order and pattern of that sort of fraud, and discovered its causes, and therefore how to infiltrate the evidence in a way that discovers that actually, yes, this is not a justified presentation. It does not realize the value that is offered. And so it would be important for a society to realize the value of that and make sure that it's the roles that it assigns or allows to be taken up by its members are never the sort that lay down before or in any way inflict fraud, because that would be to the detriment of the values which make a society honorable enough in which for children to grow and develop into virtuous people, good people, courageous people who are in no way beholden to pimps of deception and coercion, right? Wouldn't want that. So that would, of course, apply here in the form of assessing more important things than crowns of gold for perhaps meritorious, perhaps not meritorious nobility of ancient times. We're talking about systems of development which can completely destroy entire futures of people while leaving them numb to the fact that that's happened at birth and before. And it's accelerating to a certain point because of the methodologies and technologies that are being used and the techniques that are being applied, that you may already now live inside of a psychotronic prison without even knowing it, just because of the sort of effects that its influence can have. Entire worlds that should have been will never be, and entire personages that should have existed will not, or will be deformed in ways that should not have been. That's just looking at psychotronics alone. When you look at the aggregate financing and protection racketeering that's been going on since royalty ever took possession of land, you're looking at something that is an amplification or force multiplier of what is already naturally the case for really this world and the human animal within it. But when it comes to the virtues espoused, that does come from a transcendent realm, in which some men were connected by a divine inheritance, and to various degrees. And it turns out that their influence in this world diminished over time in such a way that could be predicted by the effects of a losing battle against corruption over time. But that's why we see today the consequences, the fruit, such that there's such extreme lip service paid to these values, these virtues, and these cultural mores, and there's very little action that's consistent with such. In fact, there's even a lot of covert action and even overt action which is absolutely ambivalent and contrary to such true forms of culture. So they pay a lot of lip service, and they either do or permit, they either do, assist, or permit through their complicity, their being accessories, or their being dupes to these kinds of great frauds that have been conducted in the last few hundred years, especially in keeping and in proportion with the developments in science and technology. So the worst form of evil has become a covert technocracy that has force multiplied all the tragedies already inherent to the world by an exponential margin that people can't even begin to discover, because they don't even have a conception of that possibility, and they don't know what that evidence for that would look like, especially because a lot of it is invisible. You have only to look at some cinema which highlights this fact plainly for people. You can look at the techniques of deception which can be involved by looking at watching movies like They Live and analyzing the form and content of its plot and its themes. It doesn't mean taking it to be a reality in itself. And you see the same techniques being used, the very same technologies, in fact, and the very same types of villains are at work behind it as the essential will, the spirit that brings it into being through these flesh bots, or whatever the hell you want to call them. So with the Epimethean man taking over the world and running his Machiavellian evil upon it, you can understand why a lot of certain rackets have come into existence, and why they can be so downright pernicious to the actual conscience and worth of true human beings, who alone can create the societies by fulfilling the roles which enable its culture to protect and enhance the lives of the next generations which follow on into the future. Well, this is not what's going on in the world, and all the evidence against it is not at all mollified by the fact that there are a lot of people who seem to be quite happy with the way things are going. If you look in some communities in the country and in the world, they're quite content with everything that's going on. They're giggling all the time. Okay, so obviously there have been winners, not just losers, in the system of corruption, and these are the, more or less by degrees and in different ways, the dupes, accessories, and co-conspirators of certain frauds, which I've mentioned and discussed at length in other videos, which I won't detail again here over much, except for a few which are essential to the discussion here, because they're being discussed in this template will reveal forms of distortion through this template, which, if you understood it just literally as said, you would realize that this creates a situation that is hopelessly tragic for the world in its current condition, and I don't see how that can change. By the fifths. By the fifths, that wind blew this page right off of the table. So with that situation, you have basically the need to discuss obviously very advanced forms of fraud which are taking place today, and you can discuss in general the mechanisms of fraud alongside that to act as an undergirding to seeing how the whole structure plays out. And this is critical in saying in a general way that these types of corruption, which now exist in exacerbated forms because of technology, and in which they exist in new forms because of technology altogether, that there is a corrupt entity, basically. You could look at it in a systematic way as one entity with many parts integrated into it as an organic whole, almost like a parasite, really, that can aggrandize itself and do so while presenting a manifestation of authority where it is also the investors of honor and the protectors of virtue and the producers of progress and safety for the people that do not rule, whom they coddle, yet at the same time hobble with technologies that can, and also just policies against them, which can interfere with all the echelons of their taking reasons for action or taking action at all, including in trying to determine whether or not there's cause for this, which means understanding why things are the way they are, the status quo, the way society is, what's being presented in the media and in the news, and how to think about subjects and make them bear relevance to one's world and environment. In other words, be educated and a thinking person. These people are being hobbled in every aspect, every echelon, every facet of their mentalities and their intelligence. They're being fed crap, and that affects every part of their body and every part of their mind, including crap that's in their air, food, water, and medicine. Not to mention all the financial and covert political actions that are taken to have that effect. So this is necessary in order to make a point about certain situations which are going on, which are not being properly addressed in venues such as the internet or anywhere else in society, because there are three major factors that are arresting the proper development of the communication that would be needed. And this goes even beyond the issue of whether or not the people doing the communicating can get their brain cells to communicate together and get their guts together in a way that's meaningful anyway. But it's certainly not going to happen if on top of that these three vectors are influencing their capacity to even communicate with one another and investigate in a collective and meaningful way, let alone an authoritative way through institutions which are now thoroughly infiltrated by fifth columnry. And those three vectors are covert internet topologies, fifth column networking amongst people in societies, and psychotronics. And these are force multipliers, and are things force multiplied by, rather of and by, the other factors which I'd already mentioned, which can, these technologies and means reinforce already existing rackets, which have already accrued to this self-aggrandizing group sufficient resources, technology, science, personnel, to have a breakaway civilization, which is no doubt already the case. So we're living in a very absurd sort of world where something like that is beyond the ken of most people, but the evidence for it couldn't make me more certain that it's the reality. And yet, of course, you would expect the dupes to be dupes, the accessories to be accessories. They're going to roll over and take it. And then there's the co-conspirators, the complicit. They're reaping the benefits. They're the exact ones I'm talking about. So the exceptions would be the ones that stand out as being able to make proper sense of it, having the courage to make that sense and present it to the public in good faith, which would include myself. But this can't include most people who are in on the fifth columnry, and that's all there is to that. I've seen too much evidence of it, and it goes deeper than just knowing about it. If someone's going to be a dupe and roll with the system and get handled by people who are in official roles with respect to them, and psychotronics is going to multiply itself by that, and that will be multiplied by psychotronics in all sorts of ways which can compromise people, and at the same time their communication about such things is impeded while those who run the rackets on them have their communications and propaganda amplified. Well, you're going to have a serious problem with being able to make heads or tails out of this situation, aren't you? You're not going to be able to process the data or relate it to anyone, because it's a dead end every direction you go. Besides movies like They Live for strong metaphors, if you will, that can make the point. We look at the form and content of a 1 hour 24-minute movie called Control Factor, and just watch it, because if you can't see the potential relevance of the themes and the plot content of that movie, then that my only question is how something like that got through the cinema to the public. I am a little bit kind of confused that they would actually, like what They Live, with even more directly and more realistically, the movie Control Factor. It just stuns me that even got out. It's a documentary almost, except for it's obviously cheesy and impossible scenes, which are done for artistic reasons. So with that set up, there's definitely some question as to why that was allowed into the public. But nevertheless, the evidence for fifth columny and for that technology and their blend together with the total control of the internet, which I'm not sure what could present proper model of that in cinema, but I can tell you that the actual internet is actually a weapon system of surveillance and propaganda that's been directed at the public. That's all there is to it. You either understand that it's built on that or you don't, and it's called the CIPRNet, which was a communications network between computers and the military that would handle top secret up to top secret and above data. So upon that skeletal framework, and as extensions of it, were built what we call the internet. And do you not think that they would have back doors for themselves? The fusion centers are built on top of this. They're not built apart from this as if this didn't exist. They're just amplifications and improvements on this processing ability that it already has. So that's already in place. So you can see these will interfere with the very processes in culture which are self-corrective against corruption in the first place. And they will create a complete falsification of its development, so that there's the absurdities we see today. If you just look at the weaponized culture, it's ridiculous. Or you look at the policies of governments, or you look at the way people respond to such, and you look at those who seem to mindlessly go along with these false divisions, and you're looking at pretty much the first layer of Dante's Inferno, the outer layer, where the knaves run back and forth, following standards of petty and irrational and fleshly concerns, but without understanding anything in themselves, and just being led like automatons. They almost lack enough soul to go deeper into hell. And that's what you're looking at when you're looking at the flesh bots. Their handlers are the ones that really catch the eye, because they actually know what they're doing. So there's something to be seen there. And when they can see that you see it, that's when they start their rackets against you more directly. They don't like someone who's got the dignity, the honor, and the wherewithal to see through this kind of crap that they're pulling, and hold it together, and act in a way they think is, best for their own happiness. Being flippant toward it. They don't like people being flippant toward it, because they need to have the vestiges of authority invested in them in a stable way. And it's not based on their virtue, it's based on people's being gullible enough to be duped by them into thinking they have that virtue. So we'll get on with more about that, and then later some specifics of fifth columnary, which apply on the let's just say the psychological warfare and harassment level, and how that ties in with aspects of culture which, on a spectrum of interpretation, can range from the most banal and conventional to the most out there and almost inconceivable possibilities, for example, involving breakaway civilizations who don't even need resources as we know them. And their resource is seeing what they can do with people and what kind of decisions they can make them, cause them to make, and then creating art out of people's lives. So if you can imagine a group of people doing that, hegemons of a very powerful sort, then you understand what's meant by archons up to a point. But I mean, these interpretations can all be modeled consistently with this logic. And it's just a question of what happens to be the case. How far has it gone? What world has it developed in, and so on. But on a metaphysical level, that's what it is. So the only question, all the other questions are just a matter of, I guess you could say, just conventional fact. Just is it the case or isn't it? And none of them will be a shock or a surprise, no matter how extreme. Look at psychotronics. It's extreme to people who haven't bothered to think once about it in the first place. It's like science fiction to them. But there's been science fiction about this since the late 1800s. So, psychotronics, yes, paralysis rays, different types of directed energy weapons. This is not new stuff to the mind of man, but it's been definitely created and has been weaponized. So basically, whatever could benefit humanity, they've weaponized to represent a false service or a false sort of benefit, including the protection racket that is government at this point, and turned it around so that it just accrues asymmetrical power to those who are behind the scenes of this now very powerful and probably real by now technocracy, even if it's not ancient. In the last 200 years, it could totally have been created. And so that's where it lies right now. That technology is for them. The rest of us just get to be in I guess you could call it a human zoo and amusement park, or for those who are into that kind of thing. They come here and they dwell among the creatures here for a while and live out a kind of life here, but they're not really actually beholden to this place except on certain terms, and they're aware of that. And they just a place to philander and do heinous things and do whatever you want to do and be whatever kind of person you think you want to be. It's like their own little, I don't know, you could say it's kind of like their own little simulation if you look at it mechanically. and just look at it for what it is and how it could operate as such for those types of persons. You could look at the very rich and powerful in this world that way, and the way they act and how they treat people. Look at Harvey Weinstein. I guess they're throwing him to the wolves to help make themselves look a little better. Maybe direct some attention away. But it seems to be expanding. Who knows? Maybe we can see that all become a distraction from psychotronics or something like that. They need to create a kind of sensational matter to distract from far more important, substantive matters. So we'll get more into the details of how that functions. But first we'll talk about, in the next video, the types of empirical and metaphysical evidence which can exist for these things, and how we would go about expecting them and looking for them in cases where something was off, because it could only be off because of something like this when it comes to the way things are supposed to be. So crime has to be involved. So we'll look into that in the next video.